The United States government owes $37 trillion, the largest debt any nation has ever accumulated. And this number is not just big. It is unpayably large. 2 decades ago, the entire global economy did not even produce that much in a year. Yet despite this, the U.S. is not preparing to pay the debt down. They're preparing to remove it from the system entirely. Not through default, not through brutal austerity, and not through politically impossible tax increases. The real strategy is far more subtle, far more strategic, and far more invisible. Controlled devaluation. This is the kind of policy that does not appear in press conferences, does not show up on campaign speeches, and won't ever be labeled honestly, because that would give away the game. But the mechanism is simple. Devalue the dollars you owe by devaluing the dollars everyone else holds. Quietly siphon purchasing power from savers, wage earners, retirees, and bondholders. Shift that value toward the government's balance sheet. Erase debt without ever making a payment. And here is the twist no one expects. The tools for this operation are Bitcoin and gold. Most people see crypto and gold as alternatives to government power, decentralized, outside the system, immune to political manipulation. But what is unfolding right now is the opposite. The government is positioning these assets as instruments in a massive, multi-year monetary restructuring. A monetary reset disguised as innovation, national security, and digital leadership. But to understand how this works, you must understand something most people get wrong. Government debt is nothing like your debt. When you owe a bank money, you have to work harder, cut expenses, or sell assets. Governments do not need to do any of that. Because they control the unit the debt is denominated in, they can change the rules. They can redefine what a dollar is. They can reprice the assets they own. And they can make debt disappear without ever paying it back in real value. This strategy has a name: a monetary reset. And the United States has executed one before ruthlessly. In 1933, with the country drowning in the aftermath of the Great Depression, the U.S. was facing rising debt, collapsing prices, and a deflationary vortex. Debt to GDP was 40% and climbing. President Franklin Roosevelt responded with one of the most aggressive financial moves in American history. He revalued gold. For 54 years, gold had been fixed at $20.67 per ounce. The dollar itself was defined as 1 per 20 of an ounce of gold, but the government could not pay its debts at that price. So Roosevelt issued Executive Order 61102, making it illegal for Americans to own gold. People were forced to turn it in for dollars at the official rate. Once the gold was in the government's hands, Roosevelt raised the price to $35 per ounce, a 69% jump overnight. That single change instantly created billions of dollars of new value on the government's balance sheet. Their gold reserves were suddenly worth almost 70% more. Meanwhile, the dollars citizens held became worth less. Purchasing power fell over the next decade by nearly 40%. And through this simple revaluation, the government quietly erased a massive portion of its debt burden, all while ordinary Americans paid the cost through inflation. This is the blueprint. It is not a conspiracy. It is historical record, and the same logic applies today. Except now, the tools have changed. Instead of just gold, the new strategic assets include Bitcoin. Fast forward to today. The U.S. owes $37 trillion. The debt to GDP ratio is 132%, a level previously seen only during World War II. Annual interest payments exceed $1.2 trillion, more than any federal program except Social Security. If interest rates stay elevated, the figure could reach $1.8 trillion by 2027. That is nearly 6% of the entire nation's GDP going to interest alone. No economy can sustain that. Every financial agency knows this. The Federal Reserve knows this. The Treasury knows this. There is no mathematical scenario where this debt is repaid using traditional fiscal tools. So, what do you do when you can't pay the debt? You reduce the real value of the debt. You do exactly what Roosevelt did, except with modern tools. That brings us to something that happened with surprisingly little media coverage. On January 23, 2025, President Trump signed an executive order to establish a strategic Bitcoin reserve. The public explanation sounded patriotic: to protect American leadership, compete with China, and support innovation. But beneath that narrative lies the real purpose: balance sheet, power. Right now, the U.S. government already controls approximately 210,000 Bitcoin, most of it seized from hackers, dark web markets, and criminal cases like Silk Road and Bitfinex. Roughly $21 billion at today's prices. Not enough to matter for $37 trillion in debt, but enough to justify the creation of a formal reserve system. The new executive order does something far more important. It authorizes the Treasury to acquire more Bitcoin quietly, not by buying it publicly, because that would push prices up instantly, but through seizures, settlements, mining operations, using government energy resources, and regulatory pressure that nudges private entities into voluntary transfers. The proposed target, introduced in a bill by Senator Cynthia Lummis, is 1 million Bitcoin over 5 years. Achieving that quietly would be one of the most powerful monetary plays in modern history. Because once those reserves are accumulated, the revaluation becomes possible. Imagine this scenario. The U.S. acquires 1 million Bitcoin at an average cost of $120,000 per coin, about $120 billion total. Then, during a financial crisis or debt ceiling showdown, the government announces a new reserve valuation standard. Maybe Bitcoin is reclassified as a Tier 1 strategic reserve asset. Maybe it becomes the digital equivalent of gold. Maybe a new reference price is established to stabilize markets. The moment that happens, the government's Bitcoin holdings could jump in value by trillions. A 5x revaluation makes the reserves worth $600 billion. A 10x revaluation makes them worth over $1 trillion. Combine that with a parallel gold revaluation, say from $2,400 to $5,000 or $10,000 an ounce, and you have just engineered the single most effective debt reduction tool in modern financial history. The public sees policy. The government sees balance sheet repair. But in reality, it is a stealth wealth transfer. Savers will lose. Bondholders will lose. Anyone holding dollars will lose. But governments holding scarce assets will win. And this is only the beginning, because in the next phase, the reset becomes global. And that is where things get even more dangerous. By the time 2028 arrives, the U.S. government has quietly accumulated 1 million Bitcoin, not through reckless market buying, but through seizures, regulatory penalties, settlements, and discrete purchases routed through intermediaries that leave no market footprint. The public has no idea how large the reserve has become. Exchanges do not publish it. Analysts can only guess. And then, suddenly, the announcement drops. The United States Strategic Bitcoin Reserve is officially active. The Treasury steps forward and declares, "We hold 1 million Bitcoin, and for purposes of the federal balance sheet, we are assigning a strategic reserve valuation of $1 million per Bitcoin." Not the current price, not market consensus. A new, official, government-declared price, exactly like the gold revaluation of 1934, when Roosevelt unilaterally raised gold from $20.67 to $35 per ounce. This single move instantly multiplies the paper value of the government's Bitcoin holdings tenfold. Bitcoin that cost roughly $120 billion to acquire is now worth $1 trillion on the books. Nearly $880 billion in new balance sheet value materializes without a single productive activity, without raising a single tax dollar, without passing through Congress. Pure revaluation, pure accounting power. And yet it is more than accounting, because when the largest holder of an asset redefines its value, the market takes notice. The Treasury becomes the price setter. They establish a de facto global floor. Investors do not need to believe the strategic price. They simply need to believe the government is committed. The moment Washington signals that Bitcoin is worth $1 million to them, speculators, funds, miners, and sovereign wealth funds recalibrate accordingly. Bitcoin won't leap to $1 million overnight. It does not need to. The market reprices in waves. $300,000, $450,000, $600,000, and upward, as global confidence shifts. Over 12 to 18 months, Bitcoin drifts toward the strategic price, validating the government's balance sheet. Math. But while Bitcoin climbs, something else is falling. The dollar. A Bitcoin revaluation is not just Bitcoin going up. It is the purchasing power of the dollar collapsing. A digital token that once cost $100,000 is now priced at $1 million. That is a polite way of saying the dollar lost 90% of its value against a hard, scarce asset. The upward move in Bitcoin and the downward move in the dollar are the same event just described from different angles. And Bitcoin alone is not enough. To pull off a full-scale monetary reset, the U.S. needs a two-asset approach. Bitcoin for the future, gold for the past. The U.S. officially holds 8,133 tons of gold. That is roughly 261 million ounces, nearly a quarter of all government-owned gold on Earth. At today's price of around $2,800 per ounce, that stash is worth about $700 billion. Respectable, but nowhere near large enough to dent a $37 trillion debt problem. But here's the absurd twist. On the government's books, that gold is not valued at $2,800. It is valued at $42,000 to $22,000 per ounce, a statutory price frozen in time since 1973. According to official accounting, the entire U.S. gold reserve is worth just $11 billion less than the cost of a single aircraft carrier. Why keep such a ridiculously low number? Because a suppressed book value creates unlimited room for revaluation. And here's the next shoe to drop. The Treasury announces a strategic gold revaluation, not to market price, but far above it. They declare a new official valuation of $20,000 per ounce for reserve accounting and debt stabilization purposes. Why $20,000? Because that is the level that makes the federal balance sheet functional again. At $20,000 per ounce, the U.S. gold reserve becomes worth $5.2 trillion, up from $11 billion on the books. A 470x increase in value created with a pen stroke. Now combine the numbers. Bitcoin revaluation. $1 trillion. Gold revaluation. Trillion. Total new reserve value. $6.2 trillion. That is $6.2 trillion in newly created assets that can be used to offset debt, improve the debt to GDP ratio, and restore the appearance of solvency without paying anything back in real terms. And just like with Bitcoin, when the world's largest gold holder redefines the price, the market adapts. Gold won't hit 20,000 immediately, but it surges to 5,000, then 8,000, then 12,000. Across a few volatile years, all propelled by the Treasury's declaration and global recognition that the just reset the monetary compass. While gold rises, the dollar falls. If gold climbs from $2,800 to $20,000, the dollar has lost nearly 85% of its purchasing power relative to hard assets. Bitcoin's rise reflects an even deeper erosion. But the average American does not measure value in gold or Bitcoin. They measure it in groceries, gas, childcare, rent, and those prices start climbing relentlessly. Real inflation, not the watered-down CPI, hits 20% per year. Food prices double. Energy prices double. Rent spikes. A $100 bag of groceries becomes $180, then $220. A tank of gas costs $12 more, then $25 more. The dollar buys half of what it once did, then 1/3. If you have $100,000 in savings, you feel secure. But over 3 years of 20% real inflation, that $100,000 only buys what $35,000 would have bought before. Your purchasing power drops 65%. Meanwhile, the government's $37 trillion debt has not shrunk on paper, but in real inflation-adjusted terms, it is only worth about $13 trillion. The government effectively erased $24 trillion of debt, not by paying it back. By devaluing the dollars, the debt is denominated in euros. This is not an accident. It is the plan. Now, look at the political moves that reveal the strategy. In late 2024, Senator Cynthia Lummis introduced the Bitcoin Reserve Act, a bill proposing that the acquire 1 million Bitcoin over 5 years and hold it for at least 2 decades. Both Republicans and Democrats signed on, showing bipartisan agreement. Why? Because everyone in power knows the truth. The debt cannot be paid. It must be inflated away. Then, in January 2025, the President signed the executive order establishing the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve, giving the Treasury full authority to accumulate Bitcoin, manage digital asset policy, and weave crypto into national security strategy. On the gold side, policymakers have floated the idea of a partially gold-backed dollar, a hybrid system that sounds responsible, but is actually the perfect justification for a revaluation. At current gold prices, the U.S. could only back 3.5% of the M2 money supply. But at $20,000 gold, suddenly the dollar can be marketed as hard money again, backed by a quarter of the money supply. It is not sound money. It is the illusion of sound money, a sales pitch, masking a massive devaluation. And there is one more dimension, the international one. Because for this reset to succeed, the United States needs other nations to cooperate, or at least not resist. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have spent more than a decade laying the groundwork for a world where the dollar is no longer the central pillar of global trade. Their strategy is not ideological. It is practical. They are tired of being forced to settle commodities in a currency they do not control. Tired of absorbing imported inflation every time the United States expands its money supply, and tired of watching Washington weaponize the dollar system through sanctions. So they have been doing the one thing every nation does before a monetary shift: accumulating gold. Not a few tons here and there, thousands of tons. China officially reports around 2,300 tons, but that number is deliberately understated. Independent analysts, commercial import data, and shadow reserve estimates put the real figure somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 tons. Russia holds more than 2,300 tons officially, and continues to add to its reserves, despite sanctions. India, historically conservative, now holds over 840 tons and is accelerating its purchases. These nations are positioning themselves for a reset, not a collapse, but a recalibration of value, where fiat currencies are anchored once again to something tangible. And here's the crucial point. If the United States revalues gold to $20,000 per ounce, it does not happen in isolation. Gold is not like a domestic bond or a national currency. It is global. If the U.S. marks its gold higher, every major holder follows. China won't sit there with a balance sheet filled with gold priced at $2,800 when Washington has declared the new baseline is 20,000. Russia won't either. The world converges because gold is the one asset every central bank still trusts. So when the U.S. lifts gold to 20,000, the global price won't be $20,000, but it will reprice to the new regime. Perhaps 15,000, perhaps 22,000, depending on geopolitical adjustments. The exact number does not matter. What matters is the effect. Every country holding gold suddenly sees its reserves surge in value. Every country simultaneously devalues its own currency, and everyone reduces their real debt burdens. It becomes a coordinated monetary reset without ever requiring a formal international agreement. All of them want the same outcome: escape from impossible debt loads. The timeline for this operation is becoming increasingly clear. Throughout 2025, the United States remains in the accumulation phase. Bitcoin, seizures, quiet acquisitions, bulk purchases, routed through intermediary accounts, and increased DOJ enforcement are not random. They are the mechanism for quietly building a reserve without triggering market panic or price spikes. On the gold side, the U.S. maintains its official holdings, but begins shifting the public narrative. Politicians start talking about responsible money, strategic reserves, restoring confidence, hard asset stability. This is psychological preparation, softening the public for the idea of a return to asset-backed credibility. By 2026, the crisis phase begins. The debt ceiling confrontation spirals dangerously close to default. The bond market starts flashing warning signs, yields spike, auction coverage ratios weaken, foreign buyers step away, and credit rating agencies issue downgrades. Confidence, the only true foundation of fiat money, starts to erode. A liquidity crunch emerges as banks begin tightening lending standards. The government frames this as a sudden emergency, even though it has been mathematically inevitable for more than a decade. And when the crisis hits its peak, when markets shake and voter panic begins, Washington gains the political cover necessary to introduce extraordinary measures that would be impossible under calmer conditions. Then comes 2027, the revaluation phase. This is the pivot point. The U.S. government announces that the strategic Bitcoin reserve is officially operational. The number they reveal shocks the world: 1 million Bitcoin. Then comes the second shock. They declare that Bitcoin will be valued on the government's balance sheet at $1 million per coin, not because of market forces, but because that is the strategic reserve price that supports financial stability. And immediately after that, they unveil the gold component, a partial gold-backed dollar, justified as a return to responsible fiscal leadership. Gold, for reserve purposes, is now valued at $20,000 per ounce. The public interprets this as strength. Politicians present it as discipline. News outlets describe it as a historic moment of monetary reform. But behind the branding lies the true mechanism. The dollar is being sacrificed. As Bitcoin climbs from $100,000 to $1 million over a year or two, the dollar collapses relative to it. As gold rises from $2,800 to $20,000, the dollar collapses relative to gold. And when your currency collapses relative to the world's two primary hard assets, everything priced in that currency becomes more expensive. Inflation does not creep higher. It explodes. Not 8%, not 12%, not even 20%. We are talking 30%, 40%, even 50% annual inflation in the early stages of the reset. Food prices triple. Electricity bills quadruple. Rents rise faster than wages can adjust. Housing prices spike in nominal terms, but fall in real terms because affordability collapses. The economy enters a brutal form of stagflation. High inflation, low growth, rising unemployment. And yet, in the middle of this economic chaos, the federal government quietly achieves its real objective. A $37 trillion debt burden shrinks to the real equivalent of $12 trillion. $25 trillion of obligation disappear, not through repayment, not through taxes, not through spending cuts, but through engineered dollar destruction. Savers, pensioners, bondholders, and the middle class absorb the loss. The government survives. Creditors are wiped out. Some groups win in this transition. The U.S. government, which eliminates its debt burden. Politicians, who avoid austerity. The Federal Reserve, which retains control. Bitcoin and gold holders, who see generational gains. Foreign nations with large, hard asset reserves, which suddenly become far wealthier in real terms. The wealthy, whose assets inflate and preserve value. But the losers are the majority. The middle class. Retirees on fixed incomes. Bondholders. Pension funds. Workers whose wages lag behind inflation. Small businesses that cannot adjust prices fast enough. Renters who get squeezed out of their homes. This pattern is not new. Germany in the 1920s. Argentina in multiple cycles. Zimbabwe. Venezuela. The mechanism is always the same. Debt becomes unpayable. Currency gets devalued. Savers get wiped out. Governments walk away clean. The United States is not inventing a new playbook. It is following the oldest one in the history of monetary collapse, just with more sophisticated branding, more complex instruments, and far better storytelling. They won't call it theft. They will call it stability. They won't call it devaluation. They will call it modernization. They won't call it currency destruction. They will call it restoring confidence. And by the time the public realizes what happened, their savings will already be gone. Before the reset hits, you need to eliminate the liabilities that will crush you when inflation erupts. High-interest debt must be cleared. First, credit cards, personal loans, auto loans. Those obligations do not inflate away. They strangle you. Mortgage debt is more complex. If you locked in a fixed rate at 3-4%, keep it. That type of debt becomes a gift during inflation because the dollar you repay with is worth far less than the dollar you borrowed. But if you have a floating rate mortgage or a fixed rate that is painfully high, refinance or pay it down. Because once the reset begins, interest rates will swing violently, and adjustable loans will become financial traps. Then comes diversification. Genuine, geographic diversification. Do not keep all your wealth denominated in the US dollar. Spread risk across strong currencies from nations with low debt and disciplined monetary systems. Swiss francs, Singapore dollars, Norwegian krone. Consider international banking relationships. Explore foreign real estate in countries that are not actively destroying their currencies. Look at global companies earning revenue outside the dollar system. The entire point is simple. When the dollar collapses, you should not be tied to it like an anchor pulling you underwater. After that, focus on the assets that cannot be inflated away. Gold, Bitcoin, productive land, energy exposure, commodities, hard assets with intrinsic or scarcity-based value. But even that is not enough, because when a currency fails, the most valuable assets are not metals or coins. They are skills and relationships. The ability to repair, build, grow, fix, diagnose, treat, or organize becomes more important than bank balances. Tradespeople, medical professionals, technicians, farmers, mechanics. These people do not just survive currency collapses. They become essential, and community becomes your insurance policy. The people you trust and who trust you become the buffer against the instability that always accompanies monetary resets. You may think this sounds dramatic. You may think it sounds like some fringe doomsday theory. But the math is not speculation. The U.S. debt to GDP ratio is now 132%. Interest payments have blown past $1.2 trillion per year, more than the defense budget. No political party can fix this with taxes or spending cuts. The numbers simply do not work. Every government in this position throughout history has chosen the same path. Devaluation, quiet, engineered, systematic destruction of the currency to eliminate unpayable debt. The U.S. did it in 1933 when it revalued gold. It will do it again. The only questions have been the timing and the mechanism. The mechanism is now obvious. Revaluation of hard assets, primarily Bitcoin and gold. The timing, all signals point to 2026 and 2027. The executive orders are drafted. The strategic Bitcoin reserve framework is established. The gold-backed dollar narrative is making its way into speeches, policy circles, and financial commentary. The pieces of this system are already moving. You do not need insider information. Everything is public. You just have to be willing to see it. And here's the proof almost nobody talks about. The world's central banks are preparing. They bought more than 2,000 tons of gold in 2022 and 2023, the fastest and largest accumulation since the early Cold War. Not because they love shiny metal, but because they see the end of the current system approaching. China is quietly amassing Bitcoin through state-linked enterprises and mining operations. Russia is hoarding gold and dumping dollar reserves. BRICS nations are building parallel payment rails. These are not conspiracy theorists. They are intelligence-backed governments positioning for the next monetary regime. If they are preparing, why are not you? Here is the timeline. 1. Final time. 2025 accumulation phase. The U.S. acquires Bitcoin in the shadows. Gold rhetoric intensifies. You should be accumulating to gold, Bitcoin, hard assets. This is the window of opportunity. 2026 crisis phase. A brutal debt ceiling confrontation. Bond market panic. Spiking yields. The perfect emergency that allows politicians to approve extreme measures. Volatility everywhere. You must not panic. Sell your hard assets during this stage. 2027 revaluation phase. Bitcoin is assigned a strategic reserve value of $1,000 per coin. Gold is revalued to $20,000 per ounce. The dollar's purchasing power collapses. Inflation explodes. Households get crushed. But those who positioned early survive intact. 2028-2030 stabilization phase. A new equilibrium forms. Bitcoin stabilizes between 500,000 and 800,000. Gold stabilizes between 15,000 and 18,000. The dollar finds a new, weaker baseline. The wealth gap becomes unbridgeable. The middle class shrinks again. The only variable now is which side of this divide you end up on. What the government will never say out loud is that this entire process is intentional. It is not an accident. It is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. A controlled demolition of the currency to vaporize debt while preserving political power. Default would destroy the government's credibility forever. Devaluation destroys your wealth instead. So they choose devaluation every single time, in every country, in every era, and they are choosing it again right now. The Bitcoin reserve is not about innovation. The gold-backed narrative is not about sound money. Both are mechanisms to justify revaluation. The centerpiece of the reset. You are either collateral damage or you are positioned ahead of it. If you want a practical blueprint, here is the exact sequence. Week 1. Open a precious metals account. Buy physical gold at least 1 ounce. Build toward 10 to 20% of net worth. Week 2. Open a Bitcoin account. Buy at least a starter position. Build toward 5-15%, depending on risk tolerance. Week 3. Review your bonds. Sell long-term treasuries and corporate bonds. Rotate into hard assets or short-term instruments. Week 4. Reduce cash to 3 months of living expenses. Excess cash is guaranteed to lose purchasing power. Month 2. Begin international diversification. Foreign bank accounts, foreign real estate, foreign equities. Month 3. Build skills. Build community. Build resilience. These are the assets that survive any monetary storm. This plan is not about fear. It is about adaptation. You can be morally outraged by the unfairness and end up financially destroyed, or you can see reality for what it is and position yourself to endure it. The government does not care about fairness. It cares about survival, and it will sacrifice your purchasing power to preserve its authority without hesitation. You have 2 choices: adapt or get crushed. Hold hard assets or hold dollars and watch them evaporate. Prepare for the reset or get swept away by it. The people who understand what is coming are not panicking. They are positioning. And the only question left is this: which side will you be on when the dollar reset arrives?